I'm Jim Lewis. I'm the city manager of Pismo Beach in the beautiful central coast of California, and I serve as chair of the Leadership Council for the USC Price Athenian Society. If you're looking for a nice fall-winter getaway, Pismo Beach is the place. We have wine, sun, and the butterflies have landed as of November 1st. I'm saying that because TOT, transient occupancy tax paid at hotels, is our leading revenue source, and we definitely don't want to be a topic of conversation this evening, so please come visit Pismo Beach. A little levity there. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Dean Speaker Series event of the year. As we're all very aware, many local governments across the United States have faced economic struggles to pay off debts accrued over several years for a variety of reasons. And as a result, some cities have filed for bankruptcy. And these bankruptcies will have impacts far and wide that we may or may not even know about. Tonight we'll examine this fiscal crisis and the impacts and suggest opportunities for economic relief. And again, for once, I'm glad Pismo Beach is not a topic tonight. The Athenian Society, who's your host this evening, is the premier philanthropic support group for the Sol Price School of Public Policy. Athenian Society members are committed to the mission of USC Price School to improve the quality of life for people here and in communities abroad. Our mission, which we adopted the board today, so the dean is hearing this for the first time, the Price Athenian Society is the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy's premier organization connecting the people, resources, and opportunities that advance the mission of the school. You can become a member by supporting the school with an annual minimum gift of $1,500 a year. May I ask Athenian Society members present to please rise and be recognized? There's a few of us here. Thank you for your contributions to the school. We hope you'll join us. Membership will provide you, among other things, access to cutting-edge research and scholarship taking place at the school and a host of networking and very special opportunities. I won't be announcing one, but there is a very special opportunity next month, so this will be a great time to join. You have to just trust me. In particular, Athenian members are invited to attend events such as this featuring industry leaders with insider information. But now I'm sure you're eager to hear what these distinguished panelists have to say about municipal bankruptcy. And I have the pleasure of knowing three of them professionally, and I know you're in for a very, very good discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Jack Scott, the Dean of the Sol Price School of Public Policy. Jack Knott. Great Scott! I messed up the dean's name. And I've known this man for years. I apologize. I wish I could say it was a typo, but the staff is really good. Jack Knott, my friend, our dean, a leading scholar in the fields of political... I'm in politics, can you tell? That was a good recovery. A leading scholar in the fields of political institutions and public policy, and currently president of NASPA, the International Association of Schools of Public Affairs. He's also a member of the National Academy of Public Administration. Under Dean Knott's leadership, the Price School has experienced significant growth. In addition to several major gifts, Dean Knott was instrumental in securing the school's $50 million endowment and naming gift from the Price Family Charitable Fund in November of 2011. Before coming to USC, he directed the Institute of Government and Public Affairs at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and the Michigan State University's Institute for Public Policy and Social Research. We are happy to have Dean Knott lead the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, and he is our leader and an outstanding leader in the USC community, and we now welcome him to our event. Please join me in welcoming Dean Jack Knott.
Thank you very much, Sam. Jim. Sorry. Yeah, what can you say? Well, on behalf of the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy, I really want to welcome you to this Dean Speaker Series presented by the Athenian Society. And I'm pleased that so many of you can join us here tonight to discuss this very important topic of municipal bankruptcy. I had a little opportunity to get an inkling of this. I was on Trojan Vision a couple weeks ago talking about municipal bankruptcy as well with the Dean of the Law School. This must be, at least to those who are here, somewhat of an interesting topic, given that this is the second game of the World Series and you're not watching it. I want to especially thank our sponsors for this evening, and that's Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore, and Keenan and Associates. Please give me a round of applause and thank them for their support. And of course, I also want to offer a really big thank you to the Athenian Society Leadership Council for their tremendous efforts as we get another year with the Dean Speaker Series, and I look forward to learning more about today's meeting. I heard it was a good meeting, and aside from mission statement, you discussed several other things, so I look forward to that. Thank you all so very much. Well, this evening's topic is municipal bankruptcy. You know, there may be no more precarious and complex topic facing cities than those standing on the brink of bankruptcy or insolvency. It's a very serious situation. I come from Michigan, grew up there, and am particularly worried about the situation in Detroit, which filed for bankruptcy in July, so this is very much on my mind. But interestingly, despite the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and the much touted concern about pensions and collective bargaining and so on, the incidence of municipal bankruptcy is relatively rare. Now, I've been trying to get exact figures, and I know these people know the exact figures, so they're going to tell me what they are in a little bit. But I went to Governing Magazine, and they said that over the past 5 years, there's only been 13 general purpose municipalities that have filed for municipal bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9. And that's out of about 1,668 eligible localities, so it's a very small percentage. Another source said that there were 40 bankruptcies since the year 2000, and there's been maybe, I don't know, 600 over the course of the U.S. history. So it's a relatively rare event. Now, this is not counting the special district bankruptcies, which also occur. You know, school districts can go bankrupt, water districts, and if you add those in, you get much larger numbers. So then those numbers are much higher. But part of the reason that municipal bankruptcy is not more common is that not all the states permit it. Most states do not. And then there's a group of states that permit it with certain actions by the state government, and that's really where California comes in, and we'll talk about what those states are. You can see where they are online. There's a lot of information about that. But to put this in perspective, there were 389,000 commercial bankruptcies in the private sector over the past 5 years. So it's not nearly as common as you get in the kind of bankruptcies that happen with individuals or commercial enterprises. Yet, despite the overall rarity of municipal bankruptcy, there are some very high visibility cases, especially here in California. And this is one of the reasons this is an important topic for us. Aside from the fact that the city of Detroit is declared for bankruptcy, which is the largest city, if it goes bankrupt, to ever have gone bankrupt in the United States, there are also prominent California localities, including Vallejo, Stockton, Mammoth Lake, San Bernardino, and Orange County, that all have filed for municipal bankruptcy. And that's a fairly important, significant group of cities in California. So this is an important issue for us. And of course, as was mentioned by Jim, when a municipality files for bankruptcy, there are significant, and actions are taken, there are significant consequences for residents, businesses, bond markets, government employees and their families, et cetera. So it's not an easy, it's a difficult process and a very important one. So tonight we want to examine what is municipal bankruptcy, what are some of the key conditions and causes that get municipalities into this kind of situation, why do we have this problem, what are some of the key strategies municipalities can pursue to avoid getting into this situation, and what are the various remedies, what are the strategies for bringing municipalities back to fiscal health. We also want to, I hope, evaluate what some of the moral and value issues are involved. There's some key questions here. Detroit is talking about selling its art out of the Art Institute. Talking about pension cuts and so on. These are very significant allocations of cost and benefits to different groups, and there's moral value questions around that as well. In addition, we might ask, is the municipal law as it's written good? Should it be strengthened, weakened? Is it the right instrument? Why don't more states have it? Should all states have it? Is this a tool that's underutilized or overutilized? So we got a terrific panel to address this. People have had tremendous experience directly involved in municipal bankruptcy, but also have the kind of technical and professional expertise that can address the financial as well as the municipal management and other aspects of the question, the tax questions and so on. So let me briefly introduce each person, starting with Steve. I hope I pronounced the name right, Berliner?
That's right.
Okay. He's a partner at Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore in Los Angeles. Before that, Steve has developed an extensive negotiation and litigation practice. He has expertise in advising and defending, especially public agencies regarding laws and regulations with respect to public employee retirement plans, such as PERS, as well as on retiree health insurance issues. Then we have Michael Busch, president of Urban Futures, Inc. He joined Urban Futures in 2007 following a really unique career in municipal government, where he served as planner, finance director, treasurer, deputy city manager, and assistant city manager. So there's somebody who really knows city government. And he's now the financial advisor to the city of San Bernardino, one of those cities that has gotten itself into this situation, assisting in the bankruptcy process. And he's the past president of the Municipal Management Association of Southern California as well. So incredible expertise and involvement in this area. Bob Deis, next to him, is the city manager of Stockton, California, one of the cities I happened to mention earlier. With more than 30 years of experience in local government, Bob boasts a record of having success with troubled municipal organizations by developing successful strategic plans. And he came to Stockton in 2010, which had a history of mismanagement that ultimately led to Chapter 9 bankruptcy filing. And today, Stockton is really on the road to improvement. It's a city has adopted what's sometimes referred to as a Marshall Plan on crime, and a tax increase on the November ballot is there to fund both efforts. So it's a pretty significant turnaround, and we're really pleased that Bob has joined us as well. And last, but definitely not least, our newest Price School Board of Counselors member, Harriet Welch, is here with us as well. She's a partner at Squire Sanders, Los Angeles. And she also has more than 30 years of experience in public finance in California and New York City. She represents California bond issuers, investment bankers, letter of credit banks, and borrowers on tax-exempt financing. So it's very good to get kind of the borrower side, because they're often hit hard in these bankruptcy situations. She served as a bond counsel for the California Education Facilities Authority and several other municipality related organizations, including the County of Los Angeles, the City of Los Angeles, the City of Oakland, and the State Public Works Board, among others. So again, just a remarkable experience. So I'm going to sit down a moment and begin with a question, and we'll have the panel now. So, but please welcome them. Thank you.
Turn on the mics.
All right. I guess a green light means you can hear me. Okay. So I thought it might be good since I at least sort of vaguely knew about municipal bankruptcy, if we could start with just what is municipal bankruptcy? How can a city become bankrupt, and does it differ from commercial bankruptcy in important ways? And I didn't know if Bob or Mike, you wanted to
Sure.
start.
Well,
Would be the right person.
There's the test for bankruptcy is probably pretty similar to the private sector. I mean, the simple fact is you can't pay your bills, and so in order to kind of push the pause button and not lose all your assets as a result of defaulting on your bills, you seek protection under the bankruptcy code. In the case of municipalities, it's Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code. A lot of people view municipal bankruptcy from sort of what they understand from the private sector, and that is absolutely the wrong way to view it. In fact, when it comes to Stockton, I would say about half of what you read about with respect to Stockton's bankruptcy is just plain wrong, because people just don't understand it. The key difference between municipal bankruptcy and private sector is, number one, only the debtor, only the city can propose an exit out of bankruptcy. In the private sector, lots of different entities can propose an exit out of bankruptcy. Second one, and this is really critical in understanding the PERS issue, the city cannot dissolve. In the private sector, the entity can dissolve, Lehman Brothers. And so the tension with creditors in cutting a deal in the private sector is, will I do better by dissolving and selling the assets, or will I do better propping them up and cutting a different kind of deal? In the public sector, we cannot dissolve. In fact, we took great pains in our bankruptcy exit plan that just recently went to the judge, is we have to produce a sustainable city after coming out of bankruptcy. So a sustainable city with sustainable revenues, sustainable workforce, sustainable services. And so that's a key difference. We got to continue to be a going concern. And that takes you down different paths. The dean was referring to about selling art. What does the city look like after bankruptcy? What do you have left? And that's a moral, ethical, value-driven judgment that only the city council can decide. So the third piece, and I'll stop, is the judge cannot tell the city how to spend their money. The judge can tell the private sector how to spend their money, because there's a separation of powers. Because the United States Constitution, the judicial branch can tell the legislative branch how to spend their money. And that's really critical when we talk about the PERS issue. And the judge in Sacramento that's working on our case has repeatedly said, I can't tell the city how to use their resources, how to spend their money. So there's a huge amount of control or restrictions on the part of the judge that makes it municipalities different than the private sector.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised those restrictions. We're going to, a little later, I hope, come back to that, because there is, at least in the academic literature, some controversy about whether this is strict enough, or should it be more strict, et cetera. But let's hold on that for a moment. So, Michael, what would a city look like that gets into bankruptcy? Is it, how would you characterize it?
Well, I think Bob alluded to the obvious is your inability to pay bills, but beyond that, you have to look at, there's another, I guess you can call it, three-pronged test, and it's more specific to solvency. First is you have to be cash solvent, meaning your ability to pay your bills at that point. And secondly, you have to be budget solvent, meaning you can pay for them over a long period of time. And I think what Stockton and San Bernardino may have in common is it's easy to balance a budget. You can continue to cut things to the point where revenues match expenditures. But the third prong test is you have to be service solvent. And you have to come out of your plan with the ability to provide essential services to the community. And that, in my opinion, has been the most challenging, at least for me, is the ability to match all three of those together. That's I think one of the main reasons why in the current code, which governs Chapter 9, the judge won't tell the city how to do it, because that really is based upon the city's preference for priorities. I can tell you that when you talk to the creditors about the plan, they'll say that they don't always agree, but the reality is you have to meet all three. And that's really the hard part is juggling all three of those at one time and presenting a plan that looks and lasts over a long period of time and looks prudent.
Do you suspect that is going to be a particular challenge for Detroit, given what's the situation there? I mean, especially that third.
Yeah, I think
providing adequate services at the same time.
Yeah, I think the issues, really come down to, and as Bob referenced, what you have left when you come out of it and what assets you have to leverage, to provide, to monetize, so to speak. The reality is, Detroit is much different, I think, than both what Bob and I are dealing with. That's decades of decline and population adjustments. And I think what ultimately makes it difficult is, well, what are you really restructuring and how much of it impacts your day-to-day operation? In San Bernardino, we don't have a whole lot of debt to deal with. In fact, out of a $120 million general fund budget, we're only looking at about a $5 to $6 million a year debt service payment. So if we restructured out debt, we still have issues. And we look probably similar to a Vallejo type of case where a lot of it's labor. 85% of our budget is police and fire. And it makes it difficult to continue to provide service if you can't restructure out other things.
Did Steve or Harriet, did you want to add anything to just kind of the picture or the definition of what bankruptcy is, or do you feel we've covered it?
I could just real briefly. I come from looking at this from the labor and employment point of view, because that's what I do. I represent municipal agencies, luckily not in bankruptcy, but some of them before bankruptcy when things, especially in the last few years, have been pretty bad. And what I see as a difference is that the relationship between the employer and the employee associations or the unions and the employees, that has to develop over time. And what's different about municipal bankruptcy is you have an obligation to try to work with these people. And so if you have to work with them after you go through bankruptcy, why not work with them before? And there's a lot of things that we've been able to do with our clients in order to restructure, in order to avoid the bankruptcy. And there are a lot of tools out there, and generally, if there's a good relationship between the employer and the employee groups, you can reach agreements to try to stave off this bankruptcy. Obviously, it can't happen in every case. Sometimes the conditions don't allow it. But in certain circumstances, you definitely can work with the employees. And if you have to do that afterwards, why not do it before? Maybe you can avoid a bankruptcy.
So that is potentially also a big difference with commercial bankruptcies.
Correct.
Because you're going to be dealing with employees before and after.
Yeah, and California law was recently changed to compel a municipality to engage in good faith negotiations and have mediation with their employee groups before they can even file bankruptcy. That's something that's not required in the commercial sector.
Did you want to add
Yeah, two things from my perspective as the attorney on the panel, and although I'm not a bankruptcy attorney, I'm a public finance attorney. One thing that's odd is the bankruptcy code authorizes Chapter 9 filing if you are a municipality. So the first thing is you have to actually be a municipality, and there have been a lot of cases where entities have been kicked out because they weren't actually deemed to be municipalities. It's pretty obvious for San Bernardino or Stockton or Detroit, but so that's the first question, you have to be a municipality. The second thing that I think it's important, and you mentioned it briefly, is it has to be specifically authorized by state law to file for bankruptcy. And bankruptcy lawyers, and I'm not one of them, so I can sort of cast a few aspersions on them, they want to go in and fight their case. And in a traditional bankruptcy, they have sort of certain points in the case where they know they're going to be able to go in and fight this side or fight that side. The municipal bankruptcy sort of leaves them all a little, they don't know when do they get to fight. And so they figured out that one of the few times sort of the court lets them get in and fight is the issue of eligibility for bankruptcy. So they're really going in and trying to bring up all this other stuff when they're fighting for eligibility. Right now in Detroit, they're fighting for eligibility.
That's going on right now
The
as we
filing
speak.
was made today, an appeal on San Bernardino by PERS on eligibility, claiming that there were certain failures to meet these specific standards in the Bankruptcy Act. So they're not that exciting in and of themselves, but eligibility is now the place where that's where sort of the battle is really happening. So it's an unusual aspect of municipal bankruptcy.
Which isn't so much the case in commercial.
No, not at all, not at all.
All right. So that kind of sets the stage for us. It's a very different kind of process. It has restrictions and limitations, as were pointed out, but a very serious and important issue for several cities in California and across the country. So what I'd like to turn to now is what are some of the differences or commonalities among cities in terms of what causes them to get into this kind of situation? Are they more or less walking down the same path and they all end up in this situation, or are there real differences among them? I don't know who would like to start.
Sure, I'll take that.
Sure.
I might get disagreement among the panel here. I would start answering that with asking a rhetorical question. If someone dies of heart disease and they're heavy drinkers, they eat hamburgers every day, they don't exercise, did they die because they inherited a bad heart, or did they make some choices? My feeling is in Detroit, Stockton, and San Bernardino, they made choices. And all three cities inherited some certain handicaps, some challenges to overcome. We're not Palo Altos. We're not Manhattan Beaches. But there's a point in time where the city should have known that they were in trouble, and then that was the time to make decisions on behalf of their citizenry. And they didn't handle that. For Detroit, it happened over 40 years. For Stockton, it was over 15 years. For San Bernardino, probably over 10 to 15 years. And so what they have in common is they didn't make the right choices. They were in denial. One of the presentations I've made in a couple of different places, I steal a page from the 12-step Alcoholic Anonymous program. And what's the first step? Admit you have a problem. Another step, conduct a fearless inventory of yourself. Third step, admit it when you made mistakes. The fourth step, make amends and fix. And the fifth one is the Deis step, the truth will set you free. Okay. And these cities, to this day, I would argue, a couple of those cities haven't admitted they have a problem, that they were part of it. And so, and then, it gets handed to them because they can't
So
meet payroll.
in general, you feel that even though circumstances may differ from one city to another, an important commonality is mismanagement or poor governance of the kind of problems that cities have faced.
I totally agree. Now, we can go granular and talk about retiree medical and PERS and recession, but in fixing the organization, getting out of bankruptcy, you're still an alcoholic. You're still making bad choices. So you have to get to this core, the source of those bad choices, or else you're going to be back in that situation 7, 10, 20 years later.
Harriet, did you have some thought on that?
No, I think you're right. I mean, we've seen some bankruptcies that were sort of a one-shot deal. Orange County made bad investments. Mammoth Lakes had a huge judgment, real estate judgment, turn against them. But What we're seeing now and we're seeing play out is the sort of grinding through of not just decisions. I mean, I guess I would say also it's sort of maybe these municipalities are the exemplars of really sort of a course of dealing that most municipalities here in California, many across the country, have had to deal with, and it's, you know, it's labor contracts, it's pension issues, and it's these things they call other employee benefits, other post-employment benefits. Those are dragging down, and actually maybe cities who can declare bankruptcy are lucky compared to states who can't declare bankruptcy. How are they going to fix it? I mean, this does feel almost like an intervention. You can declare bankruptcy and maybe come out on the other side. What are states going to do? I mean, our California State Teachers Retirement System is admittedly going to be unable to pay teachers' pensions. So at some point in the future, depending on how much you can invest, but you know, unless they're going to make an 87% return, at some point they're in trouble.
But at least in terms of the scale of, let's call it just mismanagement or poor governance, something like in Orange County, for example, which made a bad investment and then got caught because of the financial crisis, that seems somehow a bit different than a city, well, if we took the extreme, Detroit or some other cities that over 15, 40 years has been, you know, not admitting it has a problem making poor decisions, right? So it can, at least there's that difference, and presumably the city like, or the municipality like Orange County can turn that around by dealing with that one thing. It's much bigger of a challenge in those other communities. Any other thought on this?
You know, when I started doing labor negotiations for municipalities about 17 years ago, it was a pretty easy process. It was just a question of what new benefits or increases we're going to give to the employees. It was only pushing, pulling and screaming, and with the 2008 financial crisis that we actually started to see a situation where it went the other way, and there is a built-in process where it's very difficult to take away benefits. And Michael was right. Most public agencies spend 80 to 85% of their money on wages and benefits. It's not, you know, the cost of electricity to run City Hall that's causing these problems. It's not infrastructure projects. When you get agencies that are either in bankruptcy or close to bankruptcy or even thinking about it, all those projects have been shelved for a very long time. No one's doing infrastructure projects. So even with public agencies going through their reserves and having nothing left for a rainy day, it was still hard to take away benefits. And of course, you want to have a good relationship with your employee groups, but that mindset of not thinking what might happen in the future and start making plans for it, that has to change, because, you know, even if Detroit sold I saw that 60 Minutes piece, I think some of that artwork's worth $100 million. You can't use that one-time money to fix a structural deficit, because once that money's gone, you can't sell the piece of art again. It's already sold and you still have the same problem. So that's something I hope we'll see going forward, is more proactive nature of the governing bodies, seeing what's happening in the future and trying to make changes in advance before it gets to this situation.
I wanted to inject, at the risk of, I don't want to bore the audience, but I want to inject a little bit of academic perspective on this. And that is, one of the problems municipalities have is that they collect general fund revenues. So it's a pooling of revenues, right? That everybody or most people pay. But that the expenditure of that revenue, or the benefits for it, right, go to very specific groups that are strongly organized. They care a lot about those benefits. You know, if you're an employee and et cetera, or a teacher or something like that, or you're getting a subsidy from the government for something. So you get a real mismatch between people who, you know, pay sort of a general amount of money and then very intense groups that get the benefits. And that's usually in you know, academia it's a collective action problem. It's a pooled resource problem because the incentive then of the political leaders is always to pay off these specialized groups because these groups care a lot, more so than the generalized taxpayer. Well, if you keep paying off these groups over 40 years or 15 years or however it is, you suddenly find yourself in trouble. And there's lots of that kind of problem in the public sector. The Congress has that to some degree. They don't like the total amount of the budget, but on the other hand, what they spend on their constituents, they really like, right? Well, that's a contradiction. But it's not a contradiction if you understand that they have very intense interests, you know, whether it's in the defense industry or one industry or another, wanting those benefits. And when they respond to those collectively, they end up with a budget that's too big. And a lot of municipalities face that. There's also something that you've mentioned of crowding out, where eventually you can't build anything, you can't do it. Basically, your whole budget is made up, like I think was the case in Stockton. It was like over 70% was paid for the police and fire or police department. 80%, just for that. So it crowds out everything else. It just slowly over time, it takes over everything, and then you get in a situation where you can't meet those three criteria, right? You're not providing the kind of services you need. And then you also have, kind of like Harriet is mentioning, you have these kind of unforeseen, they could be catastrophes, you know, like the financial crisis. You're way leveraged out there, kind of like no different than Lehman Brothers, only you're Orange County, and suddenly, wham, the market takes a turn and you're in trouble. You get that as one of the causes. And then I feel that there's some also very fundamental structural causes. It's not to say there aren't, and there have been, terrible governance and mismanagement issues, like you say, across all these. But when you think of a place like Detroit, and you figure that it had, you know, over 2 million people, you know, 15 years ago, and it now has, you know, maybe 700,000. There are 45,000 abandoned buildings. You know, they have the highest property tax in the state of Michigan and one of the highest in the country. They have one of the highest income taxes in the country. You know, they have been facing a situation where people have been fleeing, businesses and people, to keep municipal services going. They've had to raise and raise and raise taxes, which causes more people to leave. And it's a downward cycle. And then on top of that, the kind of governance problems. It's created just an enormous issue. So I really appreciate the perspective in terms of, you know, you're really talking about kind of the crowding out, and you're talking really about the kind of financial catastrophe or some other kind of catastrophe, the mismanagement. There's several causes, and some of them are common. I think it's very important to point out that often you find, you know, like in Detroit or others, you find sort of governance issues. They're not really dealing with it, or sometimes even Detroit corruption. But it's a serious kind of question, and so I want to get into in just a minute kind of your point that was just made about how can we avoid getting into this situation, right? Because that seems really important. I did want to ask a question about possible remedies at this point before we get into the preventive medicine. What is the corrective medicine? And you know, could we discuss that a little bit? Strategies for remedying when you go in, you do bankruptcy. What are some of the things from bonds to talking about collective bargaining to other issues? And could we start with bonds and
Sure.
the issue?
I love bonds. Well, bonds as a remedy is sort of a hard thing because, once you're in bankruptcy, you're not really able to take on debt, although Detroit is trying to get some debtor in possession financing, which is a new thing for muni bankruptcy. But I think that there's sort of an approach with financing where financing can be a remedy when you look at it and you look at sort of selling art is not a good analogy, but looking at it forces the examination of what are the municipal services, the core municipal services that we should be delivering. And what we're seeing in the public finance area is municipalities looking at their services and saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be running parking garages. Maybe we shouldn't be running a zoo. Maybe we shouldn't be running, so we're not talking about police and fire, but we're talking about a whole panoply of sort of other things. And so we have seen financing being involved in monetization of assets. City of Toledo, Ohio has done a monetization of its parking garages and sort of a franchising of all its parking meter revenue, and was able to get one-time money, but also structure this so now the revenue from the private operator, who's actually Xerox, which I think is pretty cool, they do a great job, but that revenue will come in over time. So they took, okay, let's fill a hole, but also let's take long-term money. So there's financing opportunities that can be entered into sort of prior to bankruptcy. It's forcing a thoughtful analysis of what really we should be doing in this
And that happens
arena.
in bankruptcy as
No,
well?
well, yeah, in bankruptcy, as part of the plan of adjustment, the municipality can come forward and propose certain financing measures, whether it's, they call them, recovery bonds or things like that. But more often we're seeing, sort of planning ahead, trying to avoid taking the step. But yes, they can do financing coming out of bankruptcy as well.
Because one of the issues I thought in Detroit was sort of the difference between general obligation bonds and special,
Right, and special-
revenue bonds, and
So-
especially some of the
Yes, for all the
bondholders were not-
investors in the room, okay, here's your investment tip of the night, because I'm not an investment advisor and anything like that. But we used to think that general obligation bonds were the most secure, secured by general tax revenues. We have to levy taxes to pay this. Everyone said, this is the most secure. But when you go into bankruptcy under Chapter 9, actually, there's an issue about general obligation bonds because they don't really have sort of real security. They have this ephemeral tax revenue. So there's a category in the Bankruptcy Act called special revenue bonds, and that's sort of the enterprises that cities run, the water system, the electric system, in Orange County it was OCTA, Orange County Transportation Authority. Those are special revenue bonds. And when the municipality that controls them goes into bankruptcy, the judge says, uh-oh, I can't touch those. They have to keep paying. They have to keep paying even now. Even while we're in bankruptcy, they pay, and when we come out, they're fine. So special revenue bonds now have achieved a new status in terms of their desirability from investors. So we're still dealing with this issue, and Detroit is going to raise whether they can wipe out some of their general obligation bonds, and the bond market is not happy about that. So stay tuned.
Okay, what about, we're looking at remedies, collective bargaining or issues around
Yeah.
that.
Okay, well,
What can we do and how often is it done?
Well, once you're in bankruptcy, the first thing that we would have to do is be able to renegotiate the labor agreements. And they were able to do that in Vallejo. But what that happens is you just go back to the bargaining table, which you could have done pre-bankruptcy. So really what you're going to do post-bankruptcy is going to be the same things that you probably could have done pre-bankruptcy. The only difference is if you were in the middle of a contract pre-bankruptcy, the employee association doesn't necessarily have to come to the table. When you're in bankruptcy, the court says you have to renegotiate and parties are going to get to the table. So what have I seen that agencies have utilized in order to try to bring a structural deficit down and make things right going forward? Well, most of the public agencies are in CalPERS. Some have their own system, some contract with a county system under what's known as the 37 Act, but the vast majority have negotiated a contract with CalPERS to provide retirement benefits. Now, one of the things that happened over the last 20 years is that the employer not only paid a fluctuating sum into the system to provide those benefits, but there was a mandated employee contribution. And through the negotiation process, employers started paying that. And that could be 7, 8, or 9% of payroll. That would be as if your employer paid your FICA contribution if you're in the private sector. What we've seen is that is basically becoming a dinosaur. That employees are now paying their full share. And that, like I said, that's a huge change. In addition, the law has been opened up a little bit with pension reform last year, and now employees can not only pay their share, but they can pay the employer's share. Has to be done by agreement. But that's another tool that's available, and we're seeing that a lot. Employees who don't want to see their retirement benefits cut or that don't want to see salary decreases are agreeing to pay for part of the employer share. And so that could be 3, 4, 5%, it could be even higher than that. We've seen very long periods of time with no raises, reductions in benefits, capping health insurance. I've been in many negotiating tables where the employees that I'm sitting across the table from haven't gotten a raise in 7 years. And during that time, they're now paying 7, 8, or 9% into the PERS fund that they weren't before. So those are significant numbers. Cutting benefits, cutting wages, but mostly increasing the contribution to the PERS system, and then changing the system going forward. So anyone hired in the future will not get the same level of benefits when they ultimately retire as current employees. And that has a significant impact on what Harriet was mentioning, what's known as OPEBs, other post-employment benefits. And it's more of an accounting thing, but it makes a big difference in creating the right structure going forward. And that is going to be what happens post-bankruptcy as well. Those are the same things that these agencies are going to look at.
I thought maybe we could also look at San Bernardino and Stockton in terms of the remedies that were actually used
Well,
to
let
put
me,
those cities back on course.
I'm going to have a different approach probably to what they said because of San Bernardino is very unique. I think what Bob and I may have in common in our circumstance, and it probably is the same for Vallejo's, there's a city charter. And the charter is different as opposed to a generosity. The charter dictates how the city operates. And specifically in San Bernardino, the charter set the salaries. It was silent on some of the benefits, but it set salaries. It went as far also as to say that the city must have certain departments, meaning and there's a difference of opinion whether they can even be contracted out or not. And so when we looked at our circumstances in avoiding insolvency, the first thing we couldn't do was impair salaries at all. And in fact, the city had tried to do it a few years prior and was sued by the fire union and lost in state court. So then we looked at the PERS benefit, and we were able to meet with the labor groups and have some discussions with them. They were unsuccessful. We had to impose. And I think one of the challenges specifically in San Bernardino that may be the case in a lot of charter cities in California is unfortunately the elected officials think ward first, city second. And in order to implement change, it was, well, how's it going to affect my ward? And then if it didn't affect their ward, then it'd be okay. But in these cases, when you're talking about a reduction of service or employees or benefits, it affects everything. In San Bernardino's situation, it's very publicly known that the labor groups fund the campaign substantially. And it was very difficult for us to look for generic remedies.
These are public labor groups.
Public labor groups, yeah. And so it was very difficult. So we didn't have a lot of debt. Couldn't do anything with salaries. And so ultimately what ended up happening was there were people who just stopped paying. And that's, San Bernardino made a choice of either not paying its PERS obligation out of the general fund or bouncing payroll checks. And so there were some very difficult decisions made by the city council going forward. They ended up deferring somewhere between $25 and $30 million in total. That in total, not making bond payments, as well as not making some pension payments until they can create enough operating capital to function. During the time we imposed things and stopped paying, there was this negotiation between the management and the council on what to change and how to change it. And it took us 6 months, 40 council meetings to get them to reduce the labor force in some regards. And during that time, we're running on, not paying people. That's the only way to go through it. That was referred to as our pendency plan, which is just enough to get us through bankruptcy. So it was a reduction in service. It was a reduction in some benefits that we could administratively adjust, and that allowed us to at least create a balanced budget. The challenge, however, is while the budget may be balanced, there's ample amount of services that still aren't being provided. So it is not our go-forward plan. And we still face those same challenges when we try to come out of the plan of adjustment. So we don't have a whole lot of individual groups to impair, or creditors, or classes. Quite frankly, we've got the tough job of sitting down with the organization and saying, help us figure out how to continue to provide service. We're starting to get that word out. I think the one thing that to kind of piggyback on Bob's previous answer, I think San Bernardino was told a couple times by their past management, their council. I mean, there was ample presentations by the staff. Unfortunately, each time they were delivering a budget, the budget message would be, and here's a balanced budget. And the staff didn't do a good enough job of talking about what wasn't being funded and what was. And as a result, they started spending money they didn't have. And to the council's demise, things just weren't getting done, and they all got caught up. I think the recession just accelerated it a little bit more. I think inevitably they would have had problems. They had a ton of foreclosures, similar to, I think, Bob's situation. And what they're left with is poor decision-making probably over about 15 years. I think PERS has its own issues, but unfortunately, in San Bernardino, the charter requires the city to give raises to police and fire based on other jurisdictions throughout the state of California. And it's based on a pooling, and so you could be, the city of Huntington Beach Fire Department, and if your council decides we've got enough money, we want to give you a raise, if that's in the benchmark of cities in San Bernardino employees get a raise. And in California, salaries impact pension costs. As salaries go up, pensions go with it. And so the city lost its ability to not only recover costs, but contain them. And from the lack of cost containment, it just spiraled to the point where they couldn't recover fast enough. And over the years, CalPERS made a lot of adjustments to their actuarial assumptions. They did rate smoothing that didn't really work out too well. They changed the discount rate, and all those things created increases that no one anticipated and weren't prepared for, specifically when you have such tight charter restrictions. So I think San Bernardino is faced with looking at this much differently than maybe what they have in prior budgets. It's been brought up that maybe the charter is something that needs to be reviewed. There are, it's no secret, there's a recall campaign against the council members there. Part of the recall group wants to focus in on the charter. They believe the charter is a big problem. There's a lot of different things to look at. In San Bernardino, it is going to take a variety of measures to get through. We are going to have to negotiate with creditors, including bondholders. We are trying to negotiate with CalPERS, to put it kindly, and the labor groups as well. And ultimately, it's going to take a combination of everything, and probably including a tax measure. So it's going to involve a little bit of everything to get through there.
Now, did I understand you correctly to say that the public employee unions were involved in campaigns for electing members of the city council?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's common.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Big time.
Okay, all right.
What do you think of that,
I'm
Bob?
going to leave it.
There's gambling in that.
Remember, I sort of converted the 12-step program to the Deis 6-step program. Conduct a fearless inventory of yourself, and then admit the mistakes you made, and then fix those. So that's the solution out of Stockton's problem. When you've had 15 years of your elected officials throwing their fiduciary responsibility under the bus to serve the interests of special interests, and that's labor, you're not going to change that by, let's sit down and talk about the real situation. They're just not going to buy that. And the reality is Stockton needed such a draconian reset button, and labor was in such denial. We needed the heft of a retired bankruptcy judge to sit down and describe to them what we could do in bankruptcy. And the gates opened up. And they actually believed the numbers for the first time. So the issues that caused Stockton's problem was debt. They went on a debt spree. The debt payments I inherited were 600% greater than what they were just before the recession, because they backloaded their debt like people do when they buy a house that's bigger than what they can afford. They backloaded the debt. So as it was backloaded, revenues were going down. Retiree medical insurance, free retiree medical insurance for employee and their spouse for life, and you only had to work 1 day. 1 day. Now you have to, in order to retire, you have to have 5 years in, but what would happen is somebody would work for the county for 4 years and 11 months, come and work for a month in Stockton, and they would get a $600,000 benefit for the rest of their lives, and it was never funded. And then enhanced retirement, and you can argue about PERS and whether it's appropriate or not, but PERS didn't do Stockton in. It was the enhanced retirement interplaying with retiree medical. I can now retire 5 or 10 years before I plan to and get this free health insurance. So the unfunded liabilities exploded. And then, because labor owned the council, we had all these hidden pays, compensation that were in all these premium pays that never really saw a sunsetting in front of council with costs. I mean, on average, I would say our employees were paid somewhere between 10 and 25% greater than the marketplace. And then it was the culture of the organization. It was just so sick and dysfunctional because it was beat up by the special interests, and another special interest were developers. Stockton is sort of a sprawl city, kind of has some similarities to Detroit, where the flight to the perimeter, the newer stuff, and the core was rotting, because that's where developers were making money, is on the perimeter. And so they got their way. So I've brought in a whole new management team that's not intimidated by those special interests. We have a council that's adopted new values on how they're going to function with respect to transparency, with respect to what's the standard for granting a benefit or a wage increase. So we've completely changed the thinking as well as fix each of these issues in bankruptcy. Okay. So with any luck, they still won't be an alcoholic when they get.
You bring up an important structural issue with regard to a number of cities in the United States. I spent a lot of time in the Midwest, and this is particularly true in the Midwest with cities like Detroit or Cleveland, et cetera, is they're very decentralized. And so there's a central city, but then there's 4, 5, 6, 10 cities surrounding that central city. And there's a huge competition for jobs, firms, development. And each city kind of gives tax breaks and other incentives, and it's kind of a race to the bottom in many ways. Everybody's trying to outdo everybody to get the shopping center, to get this, right? And I lived for a number of years in Lansing, Michigan, where Michigan State University is located. Lansing went right downhill because everything went to East Lansing, Okemos, all the nice, the suburbs were doing great. That's true to some extent in Detroit. If you go to Southland or Birmingham or Grosse Pointe, these are very wealthy areas. Southland, for example, outside of Detroit, even 10 years ago, had more office space than Detroit itself. They just basically took the commercial and moved it out of Detroit and put it outside. And this doesn't happen in a lot of other countries because they have a different structure for their municipalities. They don't allow municipalities to steal from each other and fight and have this kind of competition to the bottom. They look at the municipal region and they share the resources and focus and zone that differently, right? We haven't done that in the United States, but it's, I think, one of the fundamental reasons we have these core cities. And you add on top of that a case like Detroit with racism. I mean, there was huge, white flight. It wasn't everybody fleeing the city. It was the middle class and white people pretty much fleeing the city, leaving a very non-white, very poor population. And that's a part of the kind of structure of the way cities are. And Stockton is like that as well, so I'm glad you brought that up. So as you can see, there's a range, San Bernardino is doing the whole range of things. You've had to really change the culture, et cetera. There's the whole issue with the creditors, and thank you for that financial tip. That's very important. Does anyone here want to venture and say what recommendation you'd have for Detroit, or what do you, or is that beyond,
I would like to say, I think that Detroit is actually following a very aggressive and appropriate course. And they're taking, positions that shock the sort of general position that they're trying to not pay their general obligation bonds, and they're saying they're not, or they're going to cut or not pay their pension obligations. But I think they're doing exactly the right thing, because I think that they're in a position where there are no half measures. And these are very important issues. And as you've pointed out, they're not just important issues for Detroit, particularly the pension issue. I think we can deal with the bond issue, but the pension issue is one that I think is going to go to the Supreme Court. I think there's so many people who think, oh, you can't violate the pension obligation, but I think legally under the Bankruptcy Code, maybe they can. And I think this is going to be a real fundamental issue. So I think, I sort of say, right on, Detroit, do it.
Okay. I would also like to look at this from the point of view of who benefits and who pays. Kind of it's a value kind of question. This certainly is the case in Detroit. If you're going to cut pensions, that's employees who have been there before. If you're going to cut current employees or salaries, that's current people. If you're going to sell art, that addresses the public good nature of when art was given to the Art Institute in Detroit, people who gave that art weren't thinking that it was going to be sold off to balance the budget. When you go through this, do you think about those kinds of moral questions of intergenerational?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And how do you? I'd appreciate any thoughts.
Well, just the decision to file bankruptcy. We could cut more and balance the budget, as Michael was suggesting. But the council made a value-driven decision that we've cut enough. The city is more than just police and fire. We've cut half of our library hours. We've cut half of our recreation programs. Enough is enough. We're not going below a certain level. Otherwise, why do we exist as a city? And so that was that bottom line. And so they made that call. We couldn't cut any more safety because it would be dangerous. So another value-driven decision. our primary responsibility is for the health and safety of, in our case, 300,000 citizens. And we cut 25% of the police officers, we cut 30% of the fire department. And we just said any more would be unconscionable. And then compensation. It forced a very good conversation about what's the end game? What is a fair wage? What is fair compensation? And a lot of cities don't have that conversation. Well, we're forced to have that. So we said fair compensation is X. It's the average of the labor market. And so what we did is we took everything that was above X and we took it back. Because if we went below X, then we wouldn't have a viable agency anymore. We wouldn't have a viable workforce. And so that was all the things that we took. And so there was all these value-driven decisions. And that kind of walked us through bankruptcy and sort of developed our bankruptcy exit plan. And the last decision we made is, we beat up Wall Street, we renegotiated all of our debts, and we took all these things away from employees, and it still wasn't enough. And so do we propose to the voters a tax to simply get out of bankruptcy? And so the council said, no, I want a viable city after all this pain. And so we worked for a year to develop this Marshall Plan on crime. And so we proposed a tax measure that will be on the ballot in November, where a third of it's going to go towards getting the city on financial footing, and 2/3 of it is going to be to fund this omnibus Marshall Plan on crime. And so they kind of took lemons and turned it into lemonade, and they're going to create a city that they think the citizens deserve.
Any other thought on the value part of this?
Yeah, we.
I have two more questions, and I want to open it.
I think Harriet mentioned a process in California that you have to go through prior to getting into bankruptcy. It's referred to AB 506. It's a mediation process. I think he had mentioned San Bernardino did not go through that process. Even though the law was put in place and passed by the legislature, San Bernardino was in such dire straits financially that it was at the point where it wasn't going to make payroll prior to filing. And so they just jumped right into filing. And so obviously the discussion, and I think this is the discussion that is going to ultimately tie, I think, back to, and I agree with you, things going to the Supreme Court with pensions. At some point you got to value the pension costs versus the health, safety, and welfare, and what trumps what.
Which is maybe the fundamental value.
Which is the fundamental value for us. And so when we decided that they were going to file, the first reaction is, how can you file without mediation, and you're violating the state legislative actions. The issue was we couldn't protect health, safety, and welfare if we just had a cut in order to provide service. And we continue, at least from our foundation, to stand on that's the overreaching goal. Our term sheet has been submitted to the creditors. It's a confidential term sheet. But I can tell you there was a lot of things that the city wasn't funding that it needs to, and it's similar, I think, to what Bob is saying about his tax measure. We need to do a lot of things, not just to pay for what we're currently doing, but to pay for the things they should be doing that provide for that level of health, safety, and welfare. And at some point, something has to give in terms of what you can afford in order to meet that. What I think is important for not just Stockton or San Bernardino or maybe even Detroit, is you have to know what basic level costs actually are, and you have to know what the basic level is. It's easier to argue you need money when you can articulate what basic level services should be and how much you need. When you go and you ask somebody for money, whether it's through a tax measure or a cut, the more clearly you can define basic service levels, the easier it is to make the ask. If you're providing enhanced services, enhanced pay, enhanced benefit, it makes it a lot harder to go to a creditor or court or anybody for that matter and say, I need something. And ultimately, the court doesn't decide how to spend your money. But you do have to have the creditors agree to your plan. Not all of them, but a majority of them.
Right.
And in order to make that happen, you've got to be able to articulate that you're providing basic level service.
Thanks. Harriet? Does the, in some sense, defaulting on these general purpose bonds and so on create any kind of worry in the market, or some, the market acts like a herd sometimes and
Yes,
it runs
yeah.
away from
Bob's
things
fault.
that look.
They call it
Uncertain.
contagion. Yeah, they're very worried about it. Certainly, so when Detroit filed, they were worried that other Michigan municipalities would be punished and the market would charge them higher interest rates. And that happened for maybe like a day and a half. And then the market came back. And here in California, the market, I think, is worried about California municipalities. Rating agencies are worried. They're changing the way they're looking at us. So contagion is an issue. In Rhode Island, which was very interesting, there was a city of Central Falls, Rhode Island, that was filing for bankruptcy, and the Rhode Island legislature enacted a law that said all the general obligation bonds of municipalities in Rhode Island are secured. And so they actually sort of reassured the debt market by sort of creating this, waving this magic wand and saying they're all going to be treated as secured in a bankruptcy. And so Rhode Island was okay. So there's a fear of contagion, but it really hasn't happened. And so I think it's sporadic. I mean, Orange County, which declared bankruptcy in the early 90s, is rehabilitated back in the market, no problem. So I think when municipalities come out, maybe there'll be a period of adjustment, but then the market will accept them again.
My last question is, if you could strengthen the bankruptcy law or change it in some way, would you do so, or do you think it works pretty well as an instrument?
I'll tell you. I'm in a very political environment, to say the least, and it's no secret there's council members that have gone to jail recently, and it is very difficult in that environment to make things happen quick enough. And I don't know if it needs to be amended on, from what the court can do per se, or if 506, should be mandated no matter what. But clearly having the opportunity to talk to the creditors first, I think would have been an advantage in San Bernardino, even though cash flow wise we couldn't do it. But I think it would have certainly been an advantage to the city in the long term to start that process. As a result, the city was in a fight for eligibility for over a year. It spent millions of dollars on attorneys that could have gone to provide services or for other means. And I think that from my personal perspective, it would have been a little better if we would have gone through a process like that.
Yeah,
or been required
I was
to.
shocked at how much Detroit has already paid.
Yeah,
for
they're
consultants,
very expensive,
attorneys.
and the court process
there's,
is fairly slow,
Pretty substantial.
and so you spend a lot of money.
Yeah. Right. Good. All right. So I think that really sets us up, really covered much of the issues I wanted to cover. So maybe we could have some questions. Do we have any questions, Kevin?
Thank you, Heidi. I guess this is an academic question for you, Jack. Do we have a structural problem? And what I mean is really good people use city council as a stepping stone to get to county and to legislature and so on, and they're elected and supported by special interests, and while they serve, they make sure that their folks are taken care of and not necessarily focused on fiscal responsibility. Is that a structural problem that we not only face at the municipal level, but we're seeing it examples at the federal level, at county levels, and all over the United States?
Well, I do feel that we're facing that kind of structural problem. One of the issues is a short versus long term. I think one of the, for what other reasons you may not like the structure of LA County, having 5 supervisors, but one of the things about it is they have long terms and they have a long term perspective, and they're less likely to in some cases make the kind of decisions that we've heard described here because they have to live with those, they expect to live with those consequences over time. I also think that there are structural issues in what I described in terms of that competition among local municipalities, and you have this issue of this general revenue going to the special interest in effect. So you know, we pay taxes, we care about it, but we don't care about it as much as particular employee groups or particular development firms or others that are getting the huge benefit out of that. And that, I think, creates a structural issue. It creates an incentive for people not to make individual decisions to protect their own special interests or their own ward or things like that. And when you add all those individual incentives up, you end up with a budget that's too big for what the municipality can afford. And I'm also quite concerned personally about the role of unions in elections. I'm not opposed to unions. I'm a supporter of unions. But there's a principle of a democratic accountability in which, public employees are supposed to work for the elected principals. But when the elected principals are actually getting into office because of the public employees, that kind of inverts democratic accountability in an odd way, and I worry about that at least. So. Yes? Right over here. Could you, might be nice to state your name.
Sure, my name is Preeti Guman. I'm an MPA graduate of 2009. I had a question about when you look at labor, I look at labor in 3 different categories. One, for employees who have worked a certain amount of time for a certain benefit. The next, current employees who are going to work for some time in the future, and then retirees. How do you balance those 3 groups when you're looking at cuts?
Well, I can address that because that's exactly how the law looks at them as well. Under California law, those people who've already retired do have significant protections, and generally their benefits can't be touched. Now, there are certain circumstances where they can be, depends on how it was structured. There's more flexibility with regard to the current employees who have not yet retired, and the group that is where most of the money savings are going to be are those who have not been hired yet. If you recall, when pension reform came about, there was a lot of concern that, well, it didn't touch existing employees. And the reason it generally didn't touch existing employees is because of the way the courts have ruled over the last 60, 70 years, is that even current employees who haven't retired yet have vested interests in receiving a benefit that they may have been promised when they first started. And so for many agencies, they don't have the ability to make significant changes with the benefits that they're providing, or at least the retirement benefits. There may be an opportunity in bankruptcy based on the way the Vallejo court ruled. But I agree, that is probably going to go to the Supreme Court, and I think that if there was a ruling that you can impair retirement benefits through bankruptcy, you will probably see more public agencies go through that process. Because it's the #1 thing I hear from my clients is, what can we do about the pension benefits? What can we do about those obligations? And there are things you can do, and I mentioned some of them, but there are significant protections in the law. And for retired people and current employees who were promised a benefit, they do have significant legal protections.
How we took on that issue of slicing and dicing the groups, we got a little, I don't know if we all agree or if we have some disagreement. We've been in front of the bankruptcy judge multiple occasions. The bankruptcy judge has made it clear. He sees retirement benefits as a garden variety contract that could be impaired by bankruptcy. He hasn't been asked to make that decision. He has on retiree medical. And so we think it can be impaired. But what nobody's asking is what does that do to the organization? And how does that affect me as a viable city with viable workforce providing services? Nobody's asking that question. So we asked that question, and here's what we did. We took retirees, broke them into 2 groups. We got older retirees with no medical insurance from the city. They're getting $24,000 a year in retirement benefits. I don't know about you, but I didn't feel like touching that. $24,000, that's a pretty modest benefit. So then we took the second group of retirees. Their average benefit was $51,000 a year. And they got a $26,000 retiree medical benefit. So $77,000. So what we said was, we're taking the retiree medical. We're taking that away. And we didn't think that would impair the workforce because very few cities give retiree medical that's as big as Stockton. So we didn't think that would affect our ability to provide services. So they took a 34% haircut in their entire package. But we didn't mess with the PERS, and our people don't get Social Security. So they're back down to 51,000. And then we looked at current employees. And what we did is, will you give up your retiree medical when you retire? Absolutely, we'll give that up. Secondly, we reduced compensation. Remember I said anything above the labor market we cut? So we reduced compensation anywhere from 9 to 23%. And so a key variable in the PERS benefit is years of service, last year's wage. So we cut their benefit by virtue of cutting their pay. And so they're kind of stuck. They plan on sticking around longer. And I don't think that's so bad. So current employees lost anywhere from 34 to 50% of their retirement package. But they're still employed. They can recover that. And then new employees with retirement reform, the governor signed, their total package, they're losing anywhere from 50 to 70% compared to the old employees. So that's how we sliced and diced it. We did some data mining. We looked at each piece. What could they afford to give up? What is fair? And that, with the backdrop, is after we're done, I got to still recruit employees. And so that's why we didn't impair PERS, because 99% of all employees in the state have PERS. So if I impaired PERS, I could never recruit police officers, and I would lose police officers. And I would, in Stockton, we are the second most dangerous city in the state. We're the 8th most dangerous city in the country. If I lost police officers, we would have a municipal meltdown. And so that's why we didn't touch PERS. And people don't understand, we got PERS reform by affecting the variables in the formula. But people are so excited about taking on this red herring, this PERS, this bad guy, and they don't understand to what ends. To what ends? We can impair PERS, and then PERS would turn around and say, okay, you owe us $1 billion. That's our termination liability. And we'll say, that's fine. It's an unsecured creditor. You're going to get 0.9% on the dollar, and you know, you're out of luck. So then PERS is going to have to make the decision. They can't subsidize Stockton retirees with somebody else's money. So they would have to reduce retirement benefits by 2/3. By 2/3. And there is no way we were going to allow cutting somebody from $24,000 a year to $8,000 a year. And I'm not comfortable cutting somebody from $51,000 a year to whatever, $15,000 a year. That's how it would play out if we rejected PERS, and it's like going into Iraq. Nobody asked, well, if we win, what next? And we know we could win PERS, but what's next, we already know what that looks like, and it ain't good. So that's why we didn't touch it.
And you make a very good point about people who are on these systems don't pay Social Security, right?
Right.
So they don't get the Social Security benefit. So this is
It.
This is it. So
Yeah.
that's very significant. Yes. Yes, back here and then back.
Hi, my name's Aaron. I'm a healthcare guy. My interest in this topic is really because healthcare districts are very similar to municipalities. And I'm curious if, there's a number of states in our country that either inhibit or don't provide direct access for municipalities to, federal courts and Chapter 9 protections. You mentioned, I believe, either West Falls or Central Falls, Rhode Island,
Central Falls, yeah.
that I believe was placed in a receivership prior to its declaration of bankruptcy. I'm curious if any of you have experience, kind of a philosophical question, but is Chapter 9 the best approach for a first trial, or should we have more of these kinds of receiverships where a county assumes control? You travel this country and you see that our municipalities come along with various levels of sophistication, that's putting it nicely, and perhaps a bigger entity, like a county or a neighboring bigger municipality will have an easier time than a Chapter 9 proceeding.
I'm personally against receiverships, emergency managers. What that basically does is it turns off local self-governance. It turns off the democratic process. To me, it's the equivalent of martial law. And I think when you turn off democratic self-governance, there better be a serious reason why. There are cities in New York, there are cities in Michigan that have been in receivership for years, and they haven't come out of them yet. Where's the local self-governance? And I think that if there's a rare instance, like martial law, a receiver might be appropriate. It should be in a very narrow window. They get in and get out to turn back on the self-governance. And I'm kind of proud in Stockton, we did what Detroit is going to try to do, what other cities have tried to do, we did, and self-governance stayed alive. So I think it worked. But I think there may be 1 in 1,000 times where the governance structure just completely fails, they're ignoring it, they're in denial, and maybe a receiver has to come in. But I've seen the abuse of the receivership in some states as well.
I would agree with Bob. Even, I think in the environment that I'm in is very political. But I can tell you from watching what's going on in court, the judge kind of dictates how it's going to play out. She's pretty firm on when they're going to do things and by when, and she has not let up on them about when certain things have to happen. And she does, yield a lot of power about how things will progress through the court. And we've got active creditors too along the way that are pushing the court too. And in our case, she's been very open to listen to both sides. But the one thing that's very clear, after we met eligibility, she made it really clear the city needed to turn in a term sheet within a couple of weeks. In other words, tell us how you're going to do things. And it was a lot faster than the city was wanting to move forward. And when the city asked for a later date, she came back and said, absolutely not. You'll do it on this date.
We only have a couple minutes, so I had one last question way in the back there, and if it could be a short answer would be.
Thank
so we
you.
don't run over.
My name is Jack Wang, and I'm a graduate of MPA program in 1995. Currently, I'm a lawyer from District of Columbia and here in California. I practice law in Irvine, and I'd like to thank the Dean for hosting such a wonderful event and invite such a great panel to give us an insight on the bankruptcy into the city. Personally, I help over 200 bankruptcy for personal, Chapter 7 and 13. And I know that—
Could you hold the microphone just a little closer?
Yeah, a lot of Chapter 13 cases fall out because they couldn't sustain their income, even though you submit a plan that's approved by the court. And I like to ask the panel is that I know we've been focusing on the debt, and shouldn't we focus more on trying to raise revenue for the city in order to make sure that the city exit out of the plan? Thank you.
Let's go to the last question.
I can try to answer that shortly. In California, the voters are in control of raising revenue. You don't have a good argument to raise revenue, they're not going to agree. 2 years ago, I could have raised revenue or asked to raise revenue, and the only thing I could tell them was, you can avoid bankruptcy You can pay this free retiree medical insurance and you get the same crappy services. The voters, we did a polling, 21% would agree to that, the rest said no. So you have to have a compelling argument or something to give them for them to agree to it. And it's taken us 2 years to make that proposal.
And there's, one other dimension to raising revenue, and this is one thing that is a little bright spot in Detroit, for example, is they've been really pursuing aggressive policies to get startups and new tech industry and so on into the city itself, and they're starting actually to make some progress. They are one of the cities in the country that has more startups than most any other city, and over time that has to happen if a city like that is going to turn around. So economic development strategy is a very desirable part of the turnaround through bankruptcy, I guess, as well. I think you can see we had an incredibly knowledgeable panel, very thoughtful, so please thank them for joining us this evening.
Thank you.